Lawyer mocks janitor, but his response silences the whole courtroom. Subscribe for more and tell us, where are you watching from? The courthouse smelled of old wood and disinfectant, a sterile scent that clung to its marble halls like a badge of order. Morning sunlight filtered through tall, narrow windows, casting pale strips of light across the polished floors. The world moved with the self-importance of the powerful, attorneys in sharp suits, clerks hurrying with stacks of paperwork, judges gliding past with their robes whispering behind them. Among them, unnoticed and unacknowledged, was Jaden Carter. At 20, Jaden moved like someone who had learned to become background. He wore the navy blue jumpsuit issued to janitorial staff and kept his eyes low, his posture slightly bowed, as if he were perpetually apologizing for taking up space. His brown skin, coiled hair under a plain cap, and the cart he pushed filled with cleaning supplies marked him instantly to others as someone they didn't need to see. He knew this, had felt it in every smirk, every dismissive glance, every awkward pause when he entered a room and the conversation changed without explanation. He was used to it. Jaden lived in the South Side, in a crumbling apartment with a sick mother whose breathing wheezed like rusted pipes. They had lived there ever since his father had walked out, leaving a trail of broken promises and silence. Jaden had dropped out of high school at 16 to care for her and started working double shifts, stocking shelves at a supermarket by night and scrubbing floors at the courthouse by day. Sleep was a luxury. So were dreams. And yet Jaden dreamt, not of riches or fame, but of justice, of understanding the machinery that ruled people's lives, of sitting in those courtrooms not as an invisible body with a mop, but as someone who spoke and was heard, someone whose words mattered. His fascination had begun years ago when, during a late-night shift, he found an old legal textbook abandoned near the trash. He'd taken it home and read it slowly, page by page, over weeks. The language was dense, foreign at first, but as he parsed each term, every footnote, something opened inside him. Since then, he'd scavenged every legal text he could find, books tossed out from law offices, used manuals from flea markets, old PDFs borrowed from library computers. He read them hungrily, scribbling notes into a battered notebook he kept hidden behind cleaning rags in his cart. And when he worked, especially in courtrooms, he paid attention, not just to what was said, but how it was said. He watched body language, listened to arguments, memorized strategies. He became a silent student of law, even if the world insisted he was nothing more than a boy with a mop. But the world was cruel to those who dared dream from the bottom. Most days, Jaden cleaned Courtroom 2, the domain of Judge Allen Weston, a man with silver hair, sharp features, and a sharper tongue. Judge Weston exuded authority, but beneath it lay something colder: disdain. He spoke to janitors like intrusions and looked at defendants like dirt. Jaden avoided drawing his gaze. Then there were the lawyers. Some ignored Jaden completely, but others preferred more active disdain. One of them, Thomas Sloan, a young assistant district attorney with a sleek haircut and an inflated sense of importance, took particular pleasure in making Jaden the butt of his jokes. He once dropped a coffee cup deliberately at Jaden's feet and laughed with his colleagues as Jaden picked it up without a word. "Hey, counselor," Sloan had sneered. "You planning to pass the bar with that mop?" Jaden didn't respond. He never did. Silence was safer. But each slight added to a slow-burning fire in his chest. The courthouse was full of arrogance, but none of it was new to Jaden. He'd seen it in the eyes of supermarket managers, in the cops who rolled through his neighborhood, in the teachers who had long since given up on the kids from his side of town. He'd learned to survive it, to navigate the corridors of indifference with quiet efficiency. What most people didn't know, and what Jaden never said, was that he carried more knowledge in his head than half the people whose shoes he polished. That afternoon, while cleaning after a particularly heated trial, Jaden lingered in the courtroom. The lights were dimmed, the benches empty, and the air held a kind of stillness that only came after people left. He moved slowly, dusting, mopping, wiping down the judge's bench. But his mind wasn't on the work. It was on the case he'd just overheard. It had been a contract dispute between two small businesses, one accusing the other of violating a non-compete clause. The arguments had been weak on both sides, and Jaden had caught a detail in the plaintiff's claim that didn't align with the standard precedent he'd read just last week. He couldn't help but think about how he would have framed the defense, how he would have challenged the assumptions and questioned the interpretation of that clause. He found himself pacing slowly, whispering counter-arguments under his breath, constructing rebuttals. He reached into his cart, pulled out his notebook, and scribbled down a few points. He wasn't sure why. No one would ever read them but him. Still, it mattered. It was practice. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Startled, Jaden turned, expecting a bailiff or another janitor. Instead, it was Sloan, grinning with a look that dripped condescension. "Practicing for your opening statement, counselor," he said, arms crossed. "Careful, someone might mistake you for thinking." Jaden closed the notebook quickly and stuffed it back into the cart. "Just cleaning," he said quietly. "Sure you are," Sloan replied, stepping further into the room. "You know, you should be careful. Getting too interested in things above your pay grade might give people ideas." Jaden nodded without meeting his eyes. "I'm just doing my job." Sloan snorted and turned to leave. "Keep it that way." As the door closed behind him, Jaden stood still for a long time. The light from the high windows was fading now, leaving the room in deep amber. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sting of being reminded, once again, that his place was not his own to choose. Later that evening, Jaden returned to his apartment. The hallway smelled of mildew, the paint peeled from the walls, and his mother's wheezing was audible before he opened the door. He warmed soup, helped her sit up, gave her her medication. They didn't speak much. She was tired. He was exhausted. After she fell asleep, Jaden pulled out his books. He sat at the small kitchen table under a dim bulb and opened his notebook. He reread the case from earlier, refining his notes, underlining key statutes. He didn't know why he kept doing this. He only knew that he couldn't stop. He dreamed of justice in a world that denied it to people like him. He dreamed of becoming someone they had to listen to. He dreamed of walking into a courtroom and not being laughed at. But mostly, he dreamed of being seen. Tomorrow would be just another day of scrubbing floors and swallowing his pride. But something in him whispered that it wouldn't be like the others. Something, he felt, was coming. He didn't know what it was, only that it carried the scent of change, and that when it arrived he would either be ready or crushed. And Jaden Carter, janitor, student of law, son of the South Side, had no intention of being crushed. The next morning broke with the stubborn grayness that often hung over the city like an old coat, thick with humidity and the smell of traffic fumes. Jaden's alarm buzzed before the sun had fully risen, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet of his small apartment. His mother was still asleep in the next room, her breathing labored but steady. Jaden moved quietly, dressing in his janitor's uniform with mechanical precision. As he laced his worn sneakers, his thoughts drifted to the courtroom from yesterday and the case that had lingered in his mind long after the lights had gone out. By the time he arrived at the courthouse, the building was already humming with activity. Lawyers strode through the halls with folders tucked under their arms. Clerks whispered in corners, and the distant clatter of typewriters and printers echoed from behind closed doors. Jaden slipped into the rhythm of his routine without question, greeting the security guards with a nod, rolling his cart toward the utility closet, checking off his assigned zones. It was a dance he had perfected, one that kept him largely invisible, moving through the machinery of justice like oil through gears. But today felt different. He didn't know why exactly. Maybe it was the tightness in his chest when he passed Courtroom 2, or the way his mind refused to let go of the previous day's legal missteps. The arguments had been flawed. The plaintiff's interpretation of the clause was shaky at best, and yet the courtroom had buzzed with confidence and self-congratulation. It wasn't right. Jaden couldn't say that aloud, but he could feel it, like a splinter lodged under his skin. The courthouse cafeteria was a low-ceilinged room tucked in the basement, lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Jaden sat at a corner table, eating a microwaved egg sandwich, when he overheard two clerks talking. "That public defender? Still hasn't shown up. Judge Weston's going to lose it," one of them said, shaking her head. "On the Marquez case?" the other replied, frowning. "That's today?" Jaden's ears pricked. Marquez. He'd seen that name on a docket posted near the staff bulletin board. Luis Marquez, accused of breaking into a downtown electronics store. The details were vague, but Jaden had noticed one thing. Marquez didn't have a private attorney. He was relying on the public defender's office, which was notoriously overworked and understaffed. He left his tray and headed upstairs. Courtroom 3 was already filling when he arrived. Jaden lingered just inside the doorway, mop in hand, trying to look as though he were there to work. He blended into the wood-paneled walls, staying quiet as lawyers murmured, a bailiff barked instructions, and the judge's bench stood solemn and expectant. Judge Weston entered a few minutes later, his black robes trailing behind him like a cloak of authority. His expression was pinched, his mouth a thin line. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The state versus Luis Marquez." Luis stood at the defense table alone. He couldn't have been more than 25, his brown skin pale under the fluorescent lights, eyes darting nervously around the room. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and he leaned slightly forward as if trying to shrink into himself. "Where is counsel for the defense?" Weston asked, his voice cold. A junior clerk stepped forward. "Your Honor, we received word that Mr. Graham, the assigned public defender, is handling an emergency in another courtroom and may not arrive in time." Weston scowled. "This is unacceptable. We've delayed this proceeding once already. The defendant has been in custody for 3 weeks. "Yes, Your Honor," the clerk said apologetically, "but there's been an overload of—" "I don't want excuses," Weston snapped. He turned to Marquez. "Mr. Marquez, are you prepared to proceed without representation?" Luis blinked. "Sir, I don't know how. I don't even understand the charges properly." "The charges are clear," Weston said. "Burglary, resisting arrest. If you have no objection, the court will proceed." A rustle moved through the courtroom. Even some of the prosecutors looked uneasy. Jaden stood frozen, his pulse pounding in his ears. This wasn't right. Proceeding without counsel, especially with someone who clearly didn't understand the system, was not just unethical, it was unconstitutional. His mouth went dry, his hand tightened around the handle of the mop. He told himself to stay silent, to not get involved. But then he heard Weston's gavel strike. Very well, the state may present its opening statement. Jaden stepped forward. Your Honor, wait. The words escaped him before he fully realized what he was doing. A hush fell over the room. All eyes turned. For a second, there was only the hum of the overhead lights and the sound of someone clearing their throat in the back row. Weston squinted down from the bench. Who said that? Jaden's heart hammered. He took another step forward, face flushed. Me, sir, I apologize, but I don't think the court can proceed without legal counsel for the defendant. There was a beat of stunned silence, then a burst of laughter from the prosecution's table. One of them, it had to be Sloan, leaned toward his colleague and whispered something that made them both smirk. And you are? Weston asked, his tone clipped. Jaden Carter, sir, janitorial staff. More laughter, louder now. Mr. Carter, unless you're here to clean this courtroom, I suggest you return to your duties, Weston said, voice rising. I am, Jaden replied, his voice trembling slightly. But I also know that under the Sixth Amendment, every defendant has the right to legal representation. Proceeding without it, especially when the defendant objects, violates that right. The laughter stopped. Someone coughed. Sloan sat up straighter. Weston's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting you understand constitutional law, Mr. Carter? I'm not a lawyer, Jaden said, but I've read enough to know this isn't legal. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, from the back row, a voice rang out. Let him speak. Heads turned. Jaden looked towards the sound and saw an older man in a dark gray suit rising from his seat. His hair was silver, his posture commanding. It was Julian Howard, one of the most respected attorneys in the state. Jaden had seen him once or twice in passing, but never this close. Howard approached the bench, addressing the judge with calm authority. Your Honor, may I suggest a brief recess? It appears we have a procedural concern worth examining. Weston glared at him, but Howard's reputation was too strong to dismiss lightly. 5 minutes, the judge barked, slamming his gavel. The courtroom erupted into whispers as the bailiff called for order. Jaden stood motionless, unsure if he had just saved someone or doomed himself. Howard approached him quietly. You've read the Sixth Amendment. Jaden nodded. And you recognize the violation? Yes, sir. Howard studied him for a long moment. Interesting, he murmured, almost to himself. Very interesting. They reconvened after 10 minutes. The judge, clearly displeased, agreed to delay the proceeding until Marquez could be assigned alternate counsel. Howard, surprisingly, offered to represent him pro bono, citing concern for due process. The judge accepted reluctantly, banging his gavel with more force than necessary. Jaden didn't stay to watch the rest. He slipped out of the courtroom before the murmurs turned into questions, wheeling his cart back toward the utility closet. His hands shook as he folded his cleaning cloths, his mind racing. He had spoken. He had been heard. Later that afternoon, as he was finishing his rounds, a voice called out from behind him. Mr. Carter. Jaden turned. It was Howard. I'd like a word, the lawyer said. Jaden followed him to a small office just down the hall. Howard gestured for him to sit, then closed the door. I've practiced law for 30 years, he began. I've taught, I've litigated, I've seen just about every kind of fool who thinks he knows something about justice. But you, son, you're something else. Jaden didn't know what to say. He lowered his eyes. Howard leaned forward. Where'd you learn it?" "I read," Jaden said. "Old books, cases, whatever I can find." "You read." Howard chuckled. "Most first-year law students couldn't cite the Sixth Amendment in context. You did it under pressure." Jaden shrugged. "I just didn't think it was right. What was happening in there?" "It wasn't," Howard said, "and you were right to say so." There was a silence. Then Howard added, "Come see me tomorrow, noon. I want to show you something." Jaden looked up, confused. "Why?" "Because the law doesn't belong to people in suits," Howard said. "It belongs to those who care enough to understand it. I think you might be one of them." Jaden left the office in a daze. He walked through the courthouse like a man in a dream, passing clerks and officers who no longer looked through him. Some glanced at him with confusion, others with suspicion. But for the first time, he felt seen. That night, in the silence of his apartment, Jaden stared at the worn cover of the old law textbook that had started everything. He didn't open it. He just sat with it, breathing, letting the weight of the day settle. Something had shifted. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he had taken a step. And for the first time in his life, the ground beneath him didn't feel like it was about to give way. The next day arrived like a held breath, taut with possibility. Jaden woke before dawn, unable to sleep through the tension coiled in his chest. He moved through his morning rituals, dressing, checking on his mother, gulping down coffee from a chipped mug, like someone on autopilot. Every step toward the courthouse felt surreal. The memory of the previous day hung over him in pieces. The echo of his own voice in the courtroom, the stunned silence, Julian Howard's unexpected defense of him. It felt both unreal and irreversible. He wasn't invisible anymore. As Jaden entered the courthouse, he sensed a shift in the air. It wasn't loud or overt, but something had changed. People looked at him, actually looked, not just glanced past him as part of the scenery. Some whispered to one another, others furrowed their brows in confusion. A few nodded as they passed. He didn't know how to interpret their expressions, curiosity, suspicion, wariness, but it didn't matter. For the first time in this building, Jaden Carter was not just the janitor. He made his way to the second floor, to the office Julian Howard had mentioned. The firm's nameplate was etched in brass beside a frosted glass door. Howard and Bryce, attorneys at law. Jaden stood outside it for a full minute before knocking, adjusting the sleeves of his uniform. When he stepped inside, a receptionist greeted him with a polite, if puzzled, smile and directed him to Mr. Howard's office. Howard stood as Jaden entered. The man looked as collected as he had in the courtroom, with a crisp gray suit and a mind that seemed always one step ahead. He motioned for Jaden to sit. "I'm glad you came," he said, folding his hands on the desk. Jaden sat stiffly, unsure where to place his hands, his feet, his attention. Everything about the office exuded intellect. Bookshelves heavy with volumes, legal certificates framed neatly on the walls, case files stacked with precision. "I imagine you've had an unusual morning," Howard said, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Jaden nodded. People noticed. That tends to happen when someone challenges a judge and gets it right. Howard leaned back. "You handled yourself well. Calm, thoughtful. You know what you were talking about." "I just read a lot," Jaden said, suddenly aware of how small his voice sounded in that space. Howard's gaze sharpened. "And that's what I want to talk about." He slid a folder across the desk. Jaden reached for it hesitantly, opening it to find several pages of dense legal writing. It was a civil dispute, something about a broken contract between two business partners. "Tell me what you see," Howard said. Jaden blinked, then began to read. At first, the familiar anxiety flared, the fear of looking foolish, of being tested and failing. But as he read deeper, the fear gave way to focus. His mind, trained in silence and solitude, kicked into gear. He noted the key clause in question, recognized the ambiguity in the language around responsibility and breach. He traced a potential flaw in how damages were being assessed and how one party might be exploiting it. "It's vague here," he said slowly, pointing to the fourth paragraph. "The way they describe the conditions for financial penalties, it could be challenged. It doesn't define what counts as material failure to perform. That's open to interpretation." Howard didn't say anything. He just watched. Jaden continued. "If I were representing the defendant, I'd argue that the clause is too broad to enforce as written, and if the plaintiff insists on it, we could countersue for unreasonable enforcement of terms." When he looked up, Howard was smiling, but not with amusement. It was the expression of someone discovering a rare tool in a box of rusted ones. "You're right," he said. "That ambiguity is the weak point." Jaden closed the folder. "Is this a test?" "Something like it," Howard said. "I needed to know if yesterday was a fluke or if there's more to you." Jaden's face tightened. "And?" "There's more," Howard said. "A lot more." Jaden didn't respond right away. He couldn't. His mind was racing, not from pride but from disbelief. No one had ever looked at him like that before. Not as a burden, not as a background figure, but as someone with potential. "I want to make you an offer," Howard said after a pause. "Come work here, not as janitorial staff, as my assistant. You'd read case files, help me organize arguments, analyze contracts. I'll teach you how to think like a lawyer." Jaden swallowed. "But I'm not." "A lawyer?" Howard finished. "Not yet, but you could be. And frankly, I've seen licensed attorneys do worse than you just did." Jaden stared at him, unsure if this was a joke, a test, or something dangerously real. "I can't pay you a lawyer's salary," Howard continued, "but I can pay you better than what you're earning now. And more importantly, I can give you access. Books, mentorship, real-world experience. If you're serious about this is your first step." Jaden's breath caught. He'd imagined something like this once. In the quiet hours after his mother's medicine kicked in the dead of night with a textbook on his lap, he dared to fantasize about a door opening. But he'd never expected it to look like this. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why me?" Howard paused. "Because the law needs people who understand what justice actually means, not just what it looks like in a courtroom, and because talent like yours doesn't come along often. You didn't learn this in a classroom. You earned it. Alone. That tells me more about you than a degree ever could." Jaden looked down at his hands. They were still rough from years of labor, his fingernails short, his palms calloused. He'd been told his whole life that the world was not built for people like him to rise. And yet, here he was. "I need to think," he said. "Take the day," Howard replied. "Come back tomorrow. If you say yes, we'll start." Jaden nodded and left the office with the folder still in his hands. As he walked through the halls, the usual comments and stares followed him. But he didn't notice them the same way. He wasn't just a janitor anymore, not in his own mind. Back in his apartment, his mother sat in her usual chair by the window. He told her what had happened. Not every detail, but enough. She listened quietly, her expression unreadable. "You always wanted this," she said softly. "I don't know if I'm ready." "You were ready the first time you picked up a law book," she said. "Now someone else just noticed." Jaden barely slept that night. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, the folder beside him, rereading the clauses until the legal language blurred. The fear was there, thick and real. What if he failed? What if he wasn't enough? What if this wasn't a doorway, but a trap? But beneath the fear was something stronger. Resolve. The next morning, Jaden dressed in the same uniform he'd worn every day for 3 years. But when he walked into Howard's office, he didn't feel like a janitor. He felt like someone stepping into his real life. Howard didn't ask if he was ready. He simply handed him a new file and said, "Let's begin." And Jaden did. For the next week, he read everything he was given. He wrote summaries, asked questions, pushed himself to the edge of what he knew, and then further. He studied during lunch breaks, late at night, in the early hours of the morning. His mind soaked up information like dry earth after rain. The courthouse staff whispered, some mocking, others simply curious. A few were openly hostile. But Jaden didn't care. One afternoon, Howard handed him a particularly complex case, one involving multiple clients, overlapping agreements, and a potential conflict of interest that could collapse the entire proceeding. Jaden read it twice, then again. "There's something here," he said. Howard looked up. "What do you see?" Jaden tapped the second contract, Clause 14B. It contradicts the primary obligation in the master agreement. If they push this in court, we can argue breach of internal consistency. Howard raised his eyebrows. "You caught that fast." Jaden allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Later, as he walked through the courthouse with the file under his arm, he passed Sloan in the hallway. The prosecutor sneered but said nothing. Jaden nodded politely and kept walking. The rules had changed. He wasn't playing their game anymore. He was building his own. The weight of the days began to shift around Jaden. Each morning, as he stepped into the courthouse, the rhythm of his footsteps seemed to have changed. He still wore the same uniform, still passed through the same security checkpoint, and still pushed open the same heavy wooden doors. But something was different. He felt it in the way people moved around him now, no longer brushing past without acknowledgement, but watching, measuring, whispering. Some gazes lingered with curiosity, others with doubt, and a few with clear resentment. The janitor, who once blended into the walls, had become something of an anomaly. Jaden didn't let it distract him. Not outwardly. Inwardly, he was still grappling with the dissonance of it all. Just days ago, he had mopped these very floors without a second glance from anyone. Now, with a single file folder under his arm and a new place at Julian Howard's side, he was being treated like a riddle everyone wanted to solve, or silence. Howard had wasted no time in bringing Jaden deeper into the fold. Each morning, he handed him a new case to read, a contract to dissect, or a legal motion to analyze. Some were simple enough: small claims, landlord disputes, traffic violations. Others were tangled knots of litigation, where every word on the page carried the weight of someone's livelihood. Jaden devoured them all with a hunger that surprised even himself. His notebooks filled quickly, margins crowded with annotations, questions, and sketches of legal frameworks. He wasn't just learning the language of the law, he was beginning to think in it. One afternoon, as the late sun cast long shadows across the city skyline, Howard summoned Jaden into his office. His desk was cleared except for a single thick file. Jaden recognized that look on the attorney's face, measured, unreadable, as though weighing a decision too complex to name aloud. "We have a problem," Howard said, tapping the file. Jaden stepped forward and took the folder. Inside were dozens of pages of correspondence, depositions, contracts, and court memos. It was a case already in motion, a corporate client facing a lawsuit that could cost them millions. The issue centered on a missed filing deadline for an appeal, a procedural failure that had left the case vulnerable. The attorney responsible for the error had quietly resigned. The firm was scrambling to salvage the damage. Jaden flipped through the document, scanning quickly, piecing together the narrative. At the center of it was a man named Walter Price, the CEO of a mid-sized logistics company being sued by a former partner. The original judgment had gone against Price due to what appeared to be a clerical error and a technicality in contract interpretation. The firm had intended to appeal, but the necessary documents hadn't been submitted on time. Now, unless a compelling motion for emergency review could be filed within hours, the ruling would be finalized. Howard sat down and watched Jaden read. "Can this be salvaged?" he asked quietly. Jaden didn't answer immediately. He kept reading, flipping back and forth between pages, marking sections with sticky notes. Then he paused, frowned, and read the same paragraph 3 times. "This line," he said at last, pointing to a deposition transcript. "Price wasn't available on the day the appeal was due. He was in the hospital, emergency surgery. There's documentation in here." The attorney tried to contact him for a final signature, but didn't get a response. Howard leaned forward. "Go on." "If we argue that the client's unavailability was beyond reasonable control, and that the attorney acted in good faith to prepare the appeal, but failed to file," Howard finished. Jaden nodded. "Yes, but if we show that the delay was due to a medical emergency and that no prejudice resulted from the short delay, we might get the court to grant a retroactive extension. At least we can file a motion to that effect and request immediate review." Howard considered this, then rose from his chair and retrieved a legal pad. "Dictate." Jaden hesitated, then began. Sentence by sentence, he laid out the structure of the motion, citing relevant procedural rules and past cases with similar circumstances. Howard wrote quickly, his expression sharp with focus, occasionally adding a word or crossing one out. By the time Jaden finished, the room was quiet except for the rustling of paper. "You're sure about this angle?" Howard asked. Jaden exhaled slowly. "It's not a guarantee, but it's better than nothing, and it's true." Howard nodded once, then rose and handed the pad to his paralegal outside the door. "Get this typed, formatted, and ready for filing, now." The next hour passed in a blur. Clerks ran back and forth, printing, stamping, notarizing. Howard reviewed every page with meticulous care, pausing only to clarify points with Jaden. Finally, the motion was ready. A junior associate sprinted across the street to the courthouse, motion in hand, with 10 minutes to spare. Jaden stood at the window of Howard's office, watching the city shimmer under the late afternoon sun. His pulse was still racing. The adrenaline hadn't faded. Howard joined him. "You saved the case," he said. Jaden shook his head. "You did. I just helped." "No," Howard replied. "You saw the only viable path when no one else could. You knew the law and you applied it under pressure. That's not something I can teach. That's something you are." Jaden didn't know what to say. The words landed with a weight he couldn't fully process, but beneath his unease there was something else, a quiet, growing pride. Not arrogance, not confidence even, just the quiet knowledge that he had done something right, something real. Word of what had happened spread through the office like wildfire. Some employees approached Jaden with genuine curiosity, even admiration. A few kept their distance, and then there were those who could barely conceal their disdain. Among them was Thomas Sloan. Jaden ran into him 2 days later in the hallway outside Courtroom 1. Sloan was leaning against the wall, chatting with a group of junior attorneys. His laughter cut through the corridor like a blade. When he saw Jaden approaching, the smile vanished. "Well, well," Sloan said, stepping into Jaden's path. "Our resident genius. Heard you're solving million-dollar cases now. Impressive." Jaden met his gaze calmly. "Just doing what I can." Sloan's eyes narrowed. "Careful. People might start thinking you belong here." Jaden didn't flinch. Maybe they should. For a moment, they stood in silence, the air thick with unsaid things. Then Sloan gave a tight smile and walked away. That night, Howard handed Jaden a heavy volume from his office bookshelf. "Civil procedure," he said. "Start with the first chapter. Tomorrow we'll go over the fundamentals of discovery." Jaden took the book and nodded. At home, he read until dawn. The days turned into weeks. Jaden continued to split himself between his old duties and his new role. He still helped his mother each morning, still took the night shift at the supermarket on weekends. But inside the courthouse, he had begun to move differently. He spoke in meetings. He contributed to briefs. He answered questions from seasoned attorneys, some of whom had started to defer to him more than they liked. He was no longer just learning. He was being tested, and he was passing. One morning, Howard pulled him aside. "I've been thinking," he said, "about law school." Jaden blinked. "Law school? You're not officially on that path yet, but you could be. I've spoken to some colleagues. If you're willing, I'll sponsor you for a prep program. We'll cover the costs. You'll take the LSAT in the fall." Jaden's throat tightened. The idea had always been there, distant and unreachable, like a mountain behind glass. Now it was being placed in his hands. "I don't know what to say," he murmured. "Say yes," Howard said. "We'll take it one step at a time." Jaden nodded slowly. "Yes." He returned to his desk, the law book still open, his notes spread out like a map. Outside the window, the city moved as it always had, indifferent, relentless, full of stories it never bothered to tell. But Jaden was no longer a bystander. He was part of the story now, and the first step had already been taken. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more powerful moments and unexpected turns. And don't forget to share this one with someone who needs to see it.